it's Desiree and welcome back. So today, to stitch or not to stitch, it's kind of what I'm going to show you here. So as I'm trying to separate my threads, I'm going to be using the DMC 6 floss, and you can actually, after you cut your piece, separate them. So I do like to pull out one thread and then another one, depending upon how many I'm using. So for these projects, I'm going to use 2 threads. I like to keep a tail. I think that's strange to say, but I do. And I like to hold that down, and I'm just going to go up and down. I'm going to pick the segments at which I'm going to stitch. I'm not going to stitch in all of the areas that they show. The collections that I'm using are by Spellbinders, and they have just launched yet even more stitching dies, which is what I'm going to call them, and it's called Spring Into Stitching. So this one actually comes from the collection called a Stitch Medallion, and I'll also be using the stitched flower and then the stitched petal frame. Once I've stitched my area, I then snip the thread off and then I knot it and then cut it down to the bottom. And I do leave little tails, and you'll see why I do that. So again, these are die cuts that you can stitch on, but I'm going to be selective. So we don't have to stitch all of them. You can see I have all of my pieces die cut already that I'm going to be using. So I have a gold mirror piece of cardstock up in the left-hand corner there, and then I have the petal frame already die cut as well. I'm just going to show you a couple of them. The stitching that I'm doing is basically the same for all the pieces. So you can see I entwine in the back, and then I tie that in a knot with those 2 tails, and then I clip closer down to that base. Now, I know some cross stitchers, if they're watching this, they're cringing because we usually don't like to knot our string when we cross stitch. We just entwine it into our stitches along the back. But because it's cardstock, you really don't have that ability because of the way that we're stitching. You can see I'm going down through the center, up along the side, or vice versa, to create these long bands of thread to go around. I'm working on one of the small flowers, and it's great. It's a 2-part die. So when you use, I use the Spellbinders tape to tape them together and cut out my image. Or I could just use the outline and have a solid piece that I die cut. I'm going to, on the smaller flowers, go all the way around, and I'm using a gold thread, just like I used on my aqua medallion. So on my aqua medallion, you can see I only chose 6 areas. I didn't chose the other 4 that you could actually stitch in. You can let them open. It adds a decorative piece to your piece of cardstock. Again, once my stitching's done, I'm going to wrap the thread in between the ones in the back, and then we're going to knot it again. Same thing. And so that knot is going to sit kind of in the center, which will work if you like dimension. You don't need to use foam squares. And I'll show you that in a second as well. I'm also going to show you the larger flower, a couple of the petals that I did there. And I'm going to do something a little bit different with the threads. So for the gold that I just stitched, I used 2 threads as I was stitching. For the larger flower, I'm going to use 4 threads. Now, with the holes that we have, they're a nice size, but I wouldn't go too much bigger with that, especially when you have these points. You can see with this flower here, I'm constantly coming up in that center. So there's going to be a lot of threads just gathering in that center hole of this flower. So I think if I would have used a 4-thread layer on this, it would have started to get a little bit tight. That hole may have stretched out just a little bit. It might have torn, or might have torn. You know what I mean? It could have ripped. There you go. And I didn't want that to happen. And you don't need a lot. You don't need a heavyweight thread. When I did these before, I was asked, could you use a yarn? It would have to be a really fine yarn, and I would not suggest it. I also would not suggest the cotton pearl thread if you know what that is. So here we go. I'm going to use a dark maroon and a petal pink in the DMC. So they come in this. Now you're going to see this is going to knot up for me. That's okay. I always, after I use them, I wind them on little tiny pieces of card and put them in a box because then I know I've used them. I was a big cross stitcher, and I still am, but very rarely. So I have DMC floss, so I love when these come out because I get to use it. I miss stitching. You can see I pulled one thread from the dark, one thread out of the lighter pink, and when I put it through my needle, all I have to do is just fold it in half. And there are my 4 strands. And I'm going to do the same thing. Now, this larger flower has a double petal or a double area to stitch. So you're going to see this large area that I'm stitching. And then there's like a little tiny notch up on the top. And I'll do those individually as well. So now that I'm finished that, now I'm going to come through. I'm going to hold on to that tail. And I'm going to come from the top and back down to each of the bottoms just at the top where I stitched. You can see by mixing these 2 single strands and turning it into a 4 strand by folding it over, it's creating our own variegated look. So if you don't have a variegated thread, you can make your own by blending. This is actually blending your threads. If anybody knows Mirabilia, they're beautiful cross-stitch pieces. They take years. Okay, they take me years to complete. And that's what they do. They have you have one strand from one color, one strand from another. And as you cross-stitch, it creates this blend as it goes through. And that's what our piece is going to look like. So why do I leave those little tiny tails underneath? I take a little bit of glue on my finger and I just swipe up so that those little threads are getting stuck to the other threads, to the back. This is something that I started doing recently. So as I continue to stitch on cardstock, I learned different ways to work with it. All of our pieces are now stitched, and now we're going to build our card. And nope, no stitching on our petal frame. Again, it's another way to take this die and use it in a different way. And that's what it's about here, to take what you have and stretch it. Use it as something else. I'm going to take that panel and put that right up onto a piece of gold mirror cardstock. Because the Spellbinders mirror gold cardstock is double-sided, which I love, putting glue on this and gluing it to another piece of cardstock, it really slides around. It just has a grand old time. So I like to use double-sided tape when I adhere it, excuse me, to my A2 size card base. Excuse me. Now, this is a thought moment. That's why I'm tapping there, and people just love it when I tap. I'm going to put glue only on the stitched areas. Because you have so many threads there, and I have that knot, this is actually going to give this piece dimension. It's going to be as if we use double-sided foam squares. But to cut double-sided foam squares that size would make us all crazy, right? Right. So because that thread is there, and I'm going to use an acrylic block to glue that down or to hold that in place, that's going to make it adhere to my card. But again, it's going to automatically give it dimension. It's lifting that medallion up off of that base. I've taken one of the small flowers and I set it to the center of the larger one, and I have my tweezers, my reverse tweezers, holding that in place because again, those threads, it's popping up the edges. Want to make sure it gets down to the cardstock. And I'm adding 4 more around each of the corner on that petal frame. Again, placing that acrylic block on top. What also comes with the stitched flower set are these leaves. Very simple leaves that are die cut. So I wanted to incorporate them and I'm going to tuck them in behind the medallion. Just glue it in one spot and have them coming up around those small flowers that I've put in the corner of this card panel. We're going to do it to the other side, again, creating this line. It's on an angle, so it creates that movement going through that medallion. I'm going to take that last leaf set and I'm going to trim that down, and I'll tuck that in behind the small flower that's sitting on the larger, right in the center of our card base. Because there is so much dimension on the card, because of that stitching, I'm not going to put a sentiment on the front of this. So this will be a great card. That's great for any occasion that we have that just pops up on us. Here's a look at the card. I added some gold satin pearls from Trinity around the card on the medallion and the card base and the flowers, just to give it a little bit more sparkle. So I hope you enjoyed today's project. I hope I gave you some ideas on how you can stretch your dies, but choose to stitch or not to stitch. As always, the products that I used will be listed down below in the video description if you would like to check them out. If you have any questions, make sure you leave those down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Hey, don't forget to subscribe. I'd love to have you here, show you all kinds of different techniques and different ways that we can create our cards. Make sure you hit that thumbs up because that kind of helps with that algorithm to get us out there, to let everyone see your questions and the projects we're making. But most of all, remember what is most important for me. Every day you create art. When you take something that's nothing, a piece of paper, and turn it into something else, it is a piece of art, and that's what I encourage, and that's what I want you all to do. So always remember, be creative, everyone, and I'll talk to you in the next video. Till then.